Thomas worked in the engine room of the Meridian, a trade vessel that cut through the outer rim of space. The ship was old, worn down by years of traveling between distant planets. The walls were covered with pipes and wires that glowed with a soft blue light. The air was hot and thick with the smell of burning metal and fuel. Thomas had been working here for 3 years, and in those 3 years, not a single person had learned his name. The crew of the Meridian was strange and diverse. There were Velthians with skin that looked like crystal and glowed softly in the darkness. They spoke in clicks and whistles that Thomas could never quite understand. There were Caraxians with 4 arms who moved quickly and efficiently through the corridors, always busy with their work. There were also synthetic beings, machines with artificial intelligence built into their metal bodies. They moved in perfect rhythm, never making mistakes, never complaining about the heat or the hard work. Thomas was the only human on the ship. He was different from all the others. He had only 2 arms, 2 legs, and soft skin that could burn under the sun. He was weaker than the Caraxians, slower than the Velthians, and less efficient than the synthetic beings. At least, that is what everyone on the ship seemed to think. So they gave him the dirty jobs. The jobs that no one else wanted to do. The jobs that were dangerous and difficult. Every morning, Thomas would wake up in his small room. The room was barely bigger than a closet. There was a bed, a table, and a small window that looked out into the darkness of space. He would eat a quick breakfast of gray food that tasted like nothing, then he would go down to the engine room and work until the evening. He would fix broken pipes, clean the fuel filters, and check the power systems. He would do the same thing every day over and over again until the day blended into the next. The other crew members did not talk to Thomas much. When they did speak to him, it was only to give him orders. "Fix that pipe, human," they would say. Or, "Clean those filters, human." They never called him by his name. They never asked how he was doing. They never invited him to eat with them or rest with them. Thomas was alone on this ship, even though he was surrounded by dozens of people every single day. Thomas did not mind this very much. He had learned long ago that being invisible was safer than being noticed. He kept his head down, did his work, and collected his wages. He did not cause any problems. He did not complain about anything. He simply existed on the ship, like a machine that performed its function and nothing more. But Thomas was more than just a worker. He had a sharp mind that was always thinking. While he worked, he would notice things that others did not see. He would see problems in the way the pipes were connected and figure out how to fix them better. He would notice that the fuel filters could be cleaned in a way that was more efficient. He would see broken systems and imagine new ways to repair them. His hands moved with great skill and precision, fixing things that other workers said were impossible to repair. One day, Thomas was working on the main power system when he noticed something wrong. A circuit board was failing, and if it broke completely, the entire engine room would shut down. The ship would lose power in the middle of space and everyone on board would be in great danger. Thomas worked for hours, carefully taking the circuit board apart and rebuilding it with parts he had collected and saved over the years. When he finished, the power system came back to life stronger than before. No one thanked him. No one even knew what he had done. This was the life Thomas lived. Days filled with invisible work, nights spent alone in his tiny room, looking out at the stars and wondering if there was anything more to life than this. He had accepted that this was his fate. He was nobody. He was just a human worker on an alien ship, useful only for his hands and his willingness to work hard. Then one day everything changed. The alarm systems of the ship suddenly came alive. Red lights started flashing throughout the corridors. Thomas heard voices on the speakers calling out orders. A Galactic Coalition inspection team was coming aboard the Meridian. This was a big event. The Coalition did not often send inspectors to small trade vessels like this one. The entire crew rushed around trying to make the ship look clean and organized. They painted over stains, fixed broken decorations, and put on their best uniforms. Thomas was in the engine room when he heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Many footsteps. Heavy and official sounding. He turned back to his work, not expecting anything important to happen. Inspection teams never came to the engine room. They only cared about the main decks and the cargo holds. But this time was different. A tall figure appeared in the doorway. He was an alien, but Thomas had never seen anyone quite like him before. His skin was deep purple, almost black, and covered with lines that seemed to glow with an inner light. His eyes were large and intelligent, and they moved across the engine room with great interest. Behind him came a woman. She was human like Thomas, but she wore a military uniform that was clean and pressed. She had short dark hair and a serious expression on her face. She carried tablets and devices that Thomas did not recognize. The alien commander walked slowly through the engine room, his glowing eyes looking at everything. Then he stopped. He was standing right in front of Thomas. The woman with the tablet stopped too, and she looked at Thomas with surprise in her eyes. "Leave us," the alien commander said to his aide. His voice was deep and calm. The woman bowed and walked away, though she seemed confused about why she was being sent away. The alien commander and Thomas stood facing each other. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The only sound was the humming of the engines around them. Then the commander did something very strange. He held out his hand. It was a human gesture of greeting. Thomas had not seen another human in 3 years. "I know you," the commander said simply. His voice was kind but also filled with something that sounded like sadness. "I know exactly who you are." Thomas felt something strange happen inside his chest. His hands began to shake. He did not understand what was happening. He did not know this alien. He had never met him before. And yet, the commander was looking at him as if Thomas was someone important. Someone worth knowing. The commander's name was General Kael'thas, and he moved through the corridors of the Meridian with purpose. Thomas followed behind him, still confused about what was happening. The woman with the military uniform, whose name was Eleanor, walked beside them and spoke quietly into a small device attached to her wrist. Guards stood at attention as the general passed, their eyes forward, their bodies stiff with respect. They entered a private chamber near the top of the ship. It was a room Thomas had never been to before. The walls were smooth and white, and there was a large window that showed the endless darkness of space beyond. A table sat in the center of the room with 3 chairs positioned around it. Eleanor gestured for Thomas to sit, and he did, though his legs felt weak beneath him. General Kael'thas did not sit right away. Instead he walked to the window and looked out into the stars. For a long time he said nothing. Eleanor placed her tablets on the table and waited silently. Thomas watched the general, trying to understand what was happening and why this important military commander seemed to know him. "Your name is Thomas," the general said finally, still looking out the window. "You were born on Earth. You were a soldier. A very good soldier. Better than most, actually. Better than many." Thomas felt a strange sensation in his head, like something was trying to push its way through fog. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You do not remember me," the general continued. "You do not remember many things. That is not an accident, Thomas. That was done to you on purpose. Someone wanted you to forget who you were. Someone wanted you to forget what you could do." Eleanor pulled out a small device from her pocket. She pressed a button, and a light appeared above the table. Images started to form in the air. They were moving pictures like films, but they appeared in 3 dimensions in front of them. Thomas saw a young man in a military uniform. The face was familiar but also strange, like seeing yourself in a mirror after many years. "That is you," General Kael'thas said. 15 years ago. The images changed. Thomas saw himself standing in front of a group of soldiers. He was giving them orders. His voice sounded confident and strong. The soldiers were listening to him carefully, writing down what he was saying. Then the images shifted again. Thomas saw a map of a planet with red and blue lines showing military positions. He watched as he pointed to different locations and explained something to other commanders. The other commanders nodded and seemed impressed. "You were a strategist," Eleanor said softly. "One of the best in the entire military. You had a gift for understanding battles in ways that other people could not understand. You could see 3 moves ahead. You could predict what your enemies would do before they knew themselves." More images appeared. Thomas saw himself in a war room with dozens of other officers. They were discussing strategy for a mission. Thomas stood up and presented a plan that was completely different from what everyone else was suggesting. At first, the other officers looked confused. Some looked angry. But then they started to understand. They started to see that Thomas was right. That his way was better. "You saved lives," the general said, turning away from the window to face Thomas directly. "Many lives. In one operation your strategy saved an entire colony. 15,000 people would have died if you had not been there. If you had not thought of a way that no one else could think of." Thomas touched his head with his hand. It hurt to listen to this. It hurt to see these images of himself doing things he could not remember doing. It felt like someone was pushing memories through a thick wall inside his mind, but the wall would not break. "But there was a problem," Eleanor continued. She pulled out another tablet and showed Thomas documents filled with words and numbers. "Your methods were not always approved by the military leaders. You did not always follow the rules. You broke protocol. You did things that were not supposed to be done. And your strategies worked so well that other commanders began to fear you. They feared that you would become too powerful. They feared that you would gain too much influence. So they erased me," Thomas said. The words came out of his mouth before he could think about them. It was like someone else was speaking through his body. Yes, General Kalda said. He sat down in the chair across from Thomas. They did not kill you. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they used a technology called neural suppression. It is a very advanced technique that can lock away memories inside your mind. It can make you forget who you are. It can make you forget what you can do. They locked away your memories, gave you a new identity, and sent you away to work as a common laborer on trade ships like this one. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand on Thomas's arm. Her touch was gentle and warm. You have been forgotten on purpose, Thomas. You have been made invisible. You have been kept from remembering your own life. Thomas felt tears starting to form in his eyes. He did not fully understand why he was crying. Part of him wanted to believe that none of this was real, that it was all some kind of dream. But another part of him knew that it was true. He could feel it deep inside in a place where his real memories were locked away. Why are you telling me this now? Thomas asked. His voice was shaking. Why not just leave me alone? General Kaldas leaned forward. His glowing eyes were full of sadness and something else that looked like determination. Because there is a threat coming that the military does not know how to fight. There is an enemy called the Collective, and they are very dangerous. They are expanding into coalition space, and our conventional strategies are failing. Commanders are dying. Soldiers are dying. Entire worlds are falling. The general paused and then continued. We need someone who thinks differently. Someone who can see solutions that others cannot see. We need someone like you, Thomas. We need the soldier you were before they tried to erase you. Eleanor pulled out another small device. It looked like a pen, but it glowed with soft light. She placed it on the table between them. This device contains triggers that can help break through the neural suppression. Can help you remember. Will not be easy. Will be painful. But it is possible. Thomas stared at the device. He thought about his 3 years of working in the engine room, being invisible, being nobody. He thought about how empty his life had been. He thought about the possibility of remembering who he really was. He reached out and picked up the device. The War Council chamber was enormous and intimidating. The walls stretched high above Thomas's head, and the ceiling was made of a material that showed the stars above the ship. Long tables formed a circle in the center of the room, and sitting around those tables were commanders and officers from every major alien species in the Galactic Coalition. There were Velthians with their crystal-like skin. There were Caraxians with their 4 arms and sharp eyes. There were beings that floated in special air chambers because they could not breathe the atmosphere of the ship. There were mechanical creatures with metallic bodies that hummed softly as they moved. Thomas stood in the center of this circle with General Kaldas beside him. Eleanor stood at the edge of the chamber, near a large display screen that showed military maps and tactical information. Thomas felt very small and very alone. All the eyes in the room were turned toward him, and he could feel their suspicion, their doubt, and their anger. Honored commanders, General Kaldas began, his voice deep and commanding. I have brought before you a soldier from my past. A warrior whose tactical genius has been lost to history. I am requesting his immediate reinstatement to active military service and his assignment to this war council. The chamber erupted in noise. Commanders began speaking at once, their voices overlapping. Some spoke in languages that Thomas could not understand. Some used translation devices that created strange echoing sounds. Eleanor moved her fingers across her tablet, and the noise slowly decreased. A large Caraxian commander stood up from his seat. He had 4 arms and all of them were gesturing sharply as he spoke. His name was Commander Vextarn and his voice was loud and aggressive. This is madness, Vextarn said. You ask us to trust a human? A forgotten soldier? Where are his credentials? Where are his recent victories? How do we know this creature is not a spy sent by the Collective? Another commander stood up. She was a Velthian with skin that glowed softly in shades of blue and purple. Her name was Commander Sorel and her voice was calm but firm. The general's proposition is irregular, she said. Humans are rare in military service. This human has been out of active duty for many years. He could be unstable. He could be unreliable. We cannot afford to make mistakes. The Collective is already winning. If we make wrong decisions now, entire civilizations will fall. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He wanted to speak, but he did not know what to say. He did not remember being a soldier. He did not remember having tactical genius. He only remembered working in the engine room, fixing broken pipes and cleaning fuel filters. But then something happened inside his mind. The memories that had been locked away began to push harder against the walls. Images flashed through his thoughts. Battles. Strategies. commands given in the darkness, soldiers calling him sir. It all felt real and immediate, even though it came from a past he could not fully access. Thomas stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, sounded stronger than he felt. I understand your doubts, he said. You do not know me. You do not know what I can do. But the general does know. And I ask only for a chance to prove myself. He pointed to the tactical display that Eleanor had activated. It showed the collective's expansion into coalition space. Red lines marked their advances. Blue lines showed coalition defensive positions. The pattern was clear. The collective was winning because they were following a logical, predictable strategy. They were advancing along the shortest possible routes. They were concentrating their forces in the most strategic locations. They were following military doctrine precisely. Your problem, Thomas said, moving closer to the display, is that you are fighting like you are supposed to win. The collective is fighting like they are supposed to dominate. Both approaches follow rules. Both approaches follow doctrine. But what if there was a way to fight that no one had thought of before? Thomas reached out and manipulated the display with his hands. The Caraxians had designed the system to respond to human touch so he could move the images and change the views. He began to draw new lines on the map. He showed supply routes that could become traps. He showed reinforcement pathways that could be turned into kill zones. He showed defensive positions that could be strengthened by using the enemy's own strategies against them. If you stop fighting by the rules, Thomas explained, then the enemy cannot predict your movements. If you use unconventional tactics, then their superiority in numbers becomes less important. You can win battles that you should lose if you are willing to think differently. The chamber fell silent. Even Commander Vextarn said nothing. Eleanor smiled slightly from her position near the display. She had seen this before. She knew what Thomas was capable of when the memories began to return. General Kale thus stepped forward and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. This man saved my life during a mission that is now classified, the general said. He has saved thousands of lives with his strategic thinking. I am requesting that you give him a chance. Give him one sector of the defensive perimeter. Give him 3 weeks. If his strategies do not work, we can remove him and continue with conventional tactics. But if they do work, then we have found the key to defeating the collective. A Velthian commander who had not spoken yet stood up. Her name was Commander Lyris, and she was older than the others. She had served in the military for longer than most of the younger commanders had been alive. The general has my respect, she said slowly. And I have learned that sometimes the most powerful strategies are the ones that break the rules. I vote to give this human a chance. One by one, other commanders began to agree. Some did so reluctantly. Some still looked angry. But gradually the consensus shifted. Thomas would be given a chance. He would be assigned to the defense of Sector 7, which was one of the most threatened areas. He would have access to troop deployments, intelligence reports, and military resources. He would have 3 weeks to prove that his unconventional strategies could work. Commander Vextarn did not vote in favor, but he did not actively oppose the decision either. He simply sat down and looked away, his 4 arms folded against his body in a gesture that suggested deep disapproval. As the council meeting ended and commanders began to leave, Eleanor approached Thomas. She placed a secure communication device in his hand. They have given you authority, she said quietly, but they have not given you their trust. Many of them hope you will fail. They want to prove that conventional military strategy is superior. You will need to work very hard and very quickly to show results. The collective will not wait for you to become comfortable in your new position. Thomas looked down at the device in his hand. He thought about the 3 years he had spent as an invisible worker. He thought about the memories locked away inside his mind. He thought about thousands of soldiers and civilians who were depending on decisions he would need to make. I am ready, he said, though he was not entirely sure if that was true. Eleanor nodded. Then we have work to do. Thomas did not sleep for 43 hours. He sat in the war room with screens all around him, each one showing different information. Intelligence reports came in from the front lines. Casualty counts were updated every hour. Supply chain data flowed across his tablets. Eleanor brought him stimulants and food that he barely tasted. Other military officers came and went, watching him work, waiting to see if he would fail or succeed. The sector he had been given responsibility for was called Sector 7, and it was in terrible condition. 3 coalition worlds were under direct threat. The collective's military forces were advancing faster than the coalition's defenses could respond. The previous commander had lost 2,000 soldiers in the last battle alone. Morale was low. Resources were stretched thin. Everyone expected Sector 7 to fall within weeks. Thomas studied the patterns of the collective's military movements. He looked at where they attacked, when they attacked, and how they attacked. He noticed something that the previous commander had missed. The collective was not just being aggressive. They were following a specific pattern. They were advancing along routes that gave them the greatest strategic advantage. They were concentrating forces in locations that would provide the best defense for future positions. But this meant they were predictable. Not in an obvious way, but predictable if someone knew how to look for the pattern. Thomas began to draw up new defensive strategies. Instead of meeting the collective's forces head-on, he suggested pulling back from certain positions. Instead of fighting in the locations where the collective expected to fight, he suggested creating new battlefields in unexpected places. He proposed using supply lines as weapons. He suggested creating fake military positions to confuse enemy scouts. He recommended moving troops in ways that appeared to be retreating but were actually strategic repositioning. The local commanders in Sector 7 resisted these ideas at first. They were trained in conventional warfare. They believed that strong positions and direct confrontation were the only way to fight. But Eleanor transmitted Thomas's orders with the authority of the War Council behind them. Slowly, reluctantly, the commanders began to follow Thomas's strategies. The first battle came on the 8th day. The collective attacked a coalition defensive line that Thomas had appeared to abandon. But when the collective forces committed to the attack, coalition troops emerged from hidden positions around them. The enemy was surrounded. They had expected to find a weak position to break through. Instead, they found themselves trapped. The battle lasted only 4 hours. The collective lost 3 times as many soldiers as the coalition. It was a stunning victory. News of the success spread quickly through Sector 7. The soldiers began to believe that their new commander knew something they did not. That he could see things they could not see. Eleanor came to the war room with a smile on her face. She placed a fresh cup of stimulant in front of Thomas, though he had barely touched the last one. "The commanders are impressed," she said. "They want you to continue with these strategies." But Thomas was not smiling. He was staring at new information that had just come in from intelligence sources. He was studying the way the collective had responded to his first victory. "They are adapting," he said quietly. "Look at this." He pointed to the tactical display. The collective's military movements had changed. They were no longer following the same patterns. They were using different routes. They were deploying forces in different locations. They were still advancing, but they were no longer predictable in the same way. "Your first strategy worked," Eleanor said, "but they have adjusted. They have learned from their mistake." "Not just learned," Thomas said. He felt something cold move through his chest. "They have adapted intelligently. Someone over there is thinking about this the way I am thinking about it. Someone is analyzing my strategies and figuring out how to counter them." Eleanor leaned closer to the display. "Do you think the collective has another strategist? Someone like you?" "I know they do," Thomas said. He was certain of it now. The evidence was clear in every move they made. Every tactical decision showed the same kind of unconventional thinking that Thomas was using. "And they are using me as a model to learn from. Every battle I fight teaches them something. Every strategy one uses shows them how to think differently." Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas won more battles. His unconventional tactics continued to work. But with each victory, the collective adapted. They learned. They began to predict his moves more accurately. What had been guaranteed victories became narrow successes. Casualties on the coalition side began to increase. Eleanor brought reports from other sectors. Coalition commanders were using Thomas's strategies now, but they were not having the same success. It became clear that Thomas's genius was not just in the strategies themselves, but in his ability to continuously innovate and adapt. Other commanders could follow his plans, but they could not create new plans the way he could. In the War Council meetings, some commanders began to question whether Thomas's strategies were actually helping or hurting. They suggested that the increasing casualties in Sector 7 indicated that Thomas's methods were failing. But General Kale thus defended Thomas. "This is exactly what we should expect," the general said. "Thomas is fighting someone who thinks like he does. They are matched in intellect. What we are seeing is not failure. We are seeing a battle of minds. 2 brilliant commanders trying to outthink each other." Thomas knew the general was right. He had begun to study his enemy's strategies the way a chess player studies an opponent's moves. He could see the personality in the decisions. He could see the way the other commander thought. And slowly, Thomas began to understand something about this enemy strategist. They were methodical. They learned from each failure. They adapted quickly. But they were also constrained by something. By doctrine perhaps, or by limitations imposed by their military hierarchy. Late one night, Eleanor found Thomas looking at the stars through the war room window. His face was covered with exhaustion, but his eyes were still sharp and focused. "I understand them now," Thomas said without turning around. "My enemy. The collective strategist. I understand how they think. And I know how to beat them." "How?" Eleanor asked. "By doing something they cannot do," Thomas replied. "By being willing to sacrifice something they are not willing to sacrifice. By thinking not just 3 moves ahead but 10 moves ahead. By understanding that sometimes victory requires accepting losses that seem impossible." Thomas turned to face Eleanor. "The next battle will be the important one. The next battle will determine everything." Eleanor placed her hand on his shoulder. "Then we need to make sure you win." Thomas nodded. He could feel it now. The locked memories were coming back faster. He could remember parts of his training, fragments of past victories. And most importantly, he could feel the weight of command returning to his shoulders. He was no longer an invisible worker. He was a soldier again. He was Sir. And he had a battle to win. The final operation took 6 months to plan. Thomas worked with Eleanor and a team of intelligence officers to create something far more complex than any of his previous strategies. It was not simply a military plan. It was a psychological operation. It was a carefully constructed deception designed to exploit the way the collective strategist thought. Thomas had come to understand his enemy through months of studying their movements. The enemy strategist was brilliant, but they were also disciplined. They followed logic. They responded to information as it was presented to them. And most importantly, they believed that superior numbers and superior resources would eventually lead to victory. They believed in the mathematics of warfare. They did not believe in impossible gambles. Thomas's plan was built on an impossible gamble. "They will never expect this," Eleanor said, studying the detailed maps and tactical diagrams that Thomas had created. The plan showed a false coalition command center, hidden in a sector that appeared to be defenseless. It showed fake military communications that suggested coalition forces were stretched too thin. It showed fabricated intelligence reports indicating that the coalition's leadership was divided and uncertain. "Every piece of false information will lead them to the same conclusion," Thomas explained. He pointed to different sections of the plan. "They will think the coalition is weak. They will think this is the moment to strike with everything they have. They will commit forces that they have been holding in reserve. And when they do, they will find that every assumption they made was wrong." General Kale thus studied the plan in silence for a long time. Finally he spoke. "This is extremely risky. If the collective discovers the deception before they commit their forces, they could turn this around and destroy us instead." "That is why it will work," Thomas said. "Because it is so risky that no conventional military strategist would attempt it. But their commander will see it the way I see it. They will understand that this is the only move that makes sense. They will believe that the coalition is desperate enough to try something this bold." The plan was approved, though many commanders in the War Council expressed serious doubts. But General Kale thus had authority, and more importantly, Thomas had proven himself through multiple victories. His reputation had grown. Soldiers in Sector 7 called him the man who sees. Intelligence officers studied his strategies in military academies. Even his doubters had begun to accept that he understood warfare in ways they did not. The deception began slowly. False communications were transmitted on channels that the collective was known to monitor. Fake military units were deployed to visible locations where enemy scouts would report them. Fabricated intelligence reports were leaked through agents who worked for the coalition. Each piece of misinformation was carefully designed to support the larger deception. Eleanor worked constantly, coordinating with intelligence networks across multiple worlds. She planted evidence, created false records, and ensured that every detail of the deception was perfect. Thomas watched the collective's responses through intercepted communications. He could see them analyzing the information. He could see them beginning to believe the story that had been created for them. 117 days into the operation, the collective made their move. Their military forces began to mobilize on a massive scale. Ships that had been stationed in other sectors began moving toward Sector 7. Reinforcements were called in from across collective space. Their commanders were committing everything to what they believed would be a final, crushing victory against the coalition. Thomas stood in the war room and watched the enemy forces converge on the location of the false command center. On the display screens, he could see their ships moving through space like a swarm of insects converging on a target. "They took the bait," Eleanor whispered. She stood beside Thomas, her face showing both relief and fear. "They are committing everything. "Now we spring the trap," Thomas said. General Kael'thas gave the order, and coalition forces that had been hidden in secret positions began to move. Ships emerged from behind asteroids. Military vessels decloaked from invisibility. Soldiers who had been waiting in hidden bases began their assault. The collective's forces, which had been expecting to find a weak coalition command center, instead found themselves surrounded by coalition military power from every direction. The battle that followed lasted 47 minutes. It was not really a battle in the traditional sense. It was more like a trap snapping shut on prey that had walked willingly into the jaws. The collective's forces tried to fight back, but they were surrounded with no escape routes. They tried to retreat, but coalition ships blocked every possible direction of retreat. Their commander sent desperate orders trying to organize a defense, but the organization fell apart under the weight of coordinated coalition attacks. By the end of the 47 minutes, the collective's fleet was destroyed. 70% of their military forces in the region were gone. Thousands of ships were disabled or destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were dead or captured. The collective's expansion into coalition space came to an abrupt halt. Messages came pouring into the war room. Commander Vex Tarn transmitted his congratulations. Commander Lyris sent reports of celebrations breaking out on worlds that had been threatened with invasion. General Kael'thas stood silently for a long moment, watching the battle reports, watching the casualty counts, watching the end of a war that had seemed unwinnable. 3 days later, the War Council chamber was filled with celebration. Commanders from every species in the coalition gathered to honor the victory. Music played. Lights flashed. There was laughter and congratulations. General Kael'thas stood before the assembled commanders with Eleanor beside him. Behind them stood Thomas, dressed in a formal military uniform decorated with medals and insignia. The uniform felt strange on his skin. He was no longer the invisible worker from the engine room. He was a decorated military hero. His name would be recorded in military academies. His strategies would be taught to new commanders. Statues would be built in his honor. "This human saved the coalition," General Kael'thas announced, his voice carrying across the chamber. "His name is Thomas. He was forgotten by history, but history will never forget him again. He is our savior. He is our greatest warrior." The chamber erupted in cheers. Commanders approached Thomas and shook his hand. They spoke words of praise and gratitude. Eleanor smiled, though there was something sad in her expression. But Thomas looked out through the windows of the war chamber at the stars beyond. He understood something that none of them understood. The war was not over. It had only entered a new phase. Somewhere in the remnants of collective space, another mind was studying the records of this battle. Another brilliant commander was analyzing Thomas's strategies, learning from them, preparing counter-strategies. And in the darkness of space, in hidden bases and secret locations, other conflicts were already beginning. Conflicts that would need new strategies. Conflicts that would require a strategist who could think in ways that others could not think. Thomas was no longer invisible. But he was now trapped by his own success. He was legendary. And legendary soldiers were always needed. Always used. Always trapped in service to war. Eleanor came to stand beside him at the window. She said nothing, but she placed her hand on his arm. She understood what Thomas understood. That victory was temporary. That the cycle of conflict would continue. That Thomas would be needed again and again, creating new strategies, fighting new enemies, winning battles that others could not win. Behind them, the celebration continued. Commanders laughed and drank and celebrated the salvation of the coalition. But Thomas and Eleanor stood together at the window, looking out at the vast darkness of space, knowing that peace was an illusion that would not last.